At my son's wedding, they replaced my seat with a trash can, Ashley said with a laugh, her voice light and careless, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of the quiet humiliation she had just arranged for me. And for a moment I thought I had misheard her, that perhaps grief or aid had begun to distort the edges of my reality. But then I looked down at the seating chart again, my name written in elegant script, Margaret Collins, placed neatly beside a small black icon of a trash bin, positioned at the far edge of the reception hall near the service door, where waitstaff moved in and out carrying trays of champagne and half-eaten plates. And I felt something inside me go very still. Not broken, not shattered, just still, like a lake on a windless morning. And I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blue dress, the one I had carefully pressed the night before, the one my late husband used to say made me look timeless, and I smiled, because that is what I had learned to do over the years. Smile when something didn't feel right. Smile when speaking up would only make things worse. Smile when the people you loved most looked at you as if you no longer belonged. "It's just a joke, don't be so dramatic," Ashley added, already turning away to greet another guest, her blonde hair catching the soft golden light of the chandeliers as if nothing had happened at all. And I stood there for a second longer, holding my invitation in one hand, feeling the weight of the room settle around me, the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the distant sound of a string quartet playing something cheerful and expensive. And I told myself to breathe, to step forward, to walk into the celebration I had once dreamt of for my son, Daniel, who was now standing across the room in a tailored black tuxedo, smiling at his bride as if she had hung the stars herself. And I wondered briefly if he had seen the seating chart, if he had noticed where his mother was meant to sit, or if he had chosen not to notice at all. Because sometimes silence says more than words ever could. And I began to walk, slowly, carefully, the heels of my shoes clicking softly against the polished floor, each step measured, each breath controlled, as I made my way toward the table that had been assigned to me, passing clusters of guests who were laughing, hugging, taking photos, celebrating a union that I had once believed would bring our family closer together, not quietly push me to the edges of it. And when I reached the table, I paused, just for a moment, looking at the small round card with my name placed beside a literal trash can, its lid slightly ajar, lined with a black plastic bag, as if it were just another decorative element, just another detail in a perfectly curated event. And I pulled out the chair beside it and sat down, smoothing my dress over my knees, lifting my chin slightly, because if there was one thing I refused to give them, it was the satisfaction of seeing me react. And as I sat there, I could feel the eyes of a few nearby guests flicker in my direction. Quick glances, whispered comments, the kind of attention that pretends not to be attention at all. And I reached for the glass of water in front of me, taking a small, steady sip, my hand not shaking, not even a little. Because whatever this was, whatever game was being played around me, I understood one thing with absolute clarity in that moment. They thought this was harmless. They thought this was funny. They thought I would sit quietly and accept my place, exactly where they had decided it should be. And I let a small, polite smile rest on my lips as I set the glass back down, because I had spent a lifetime learning how to endure. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that endurance and surrender were not the same thing at all. I remained seated for a few minutes, long enough for the initial sting to settle into something quieter, something more controlled. And then I rose slowly, smoothing my dress again as if nothing about this evening had been out of place. And I began to move through the reception hall with the same calm dignity I had practiced for decades, passing tables adorned with white roses and flickering candles, each one filled with people who had come to celebrate my son's happiness, people who did not know the full story of the woman who had raised him, the years I had spent working double shifts at a small accounting office just to keep the lights on after his father passed, the nights I had sat at the kitchen table helping him with homework until my eyes blurred, the quiet sacrifices that never made it into speeches or wedding toasts. And as I walked, I allowed myself to remember the boy Daniel used to be, the one who would run into my arms after school, the one who once told me, at 8 years old, that he would take care of me when I was old, that I would never have to worry about anything again. and I wondered when that promise had faded, whether it had slipped away gradually, or if it had been replaced the moment Ashley entered his life with her effortless charm and carefully measured kindness. And I reached the edge of the dance floor, just as the music shifted to something soft and romantic, guests gathering closer as the newlyweds prepared for their first dance. And I stood there among them, just another face in the crowd, watching as my son placed his hand gently at the small of his wife's back, looking at her with a kind of devotion I had not seen directed at me in years. And I felt a familiar ache settle in my chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady, like a quiet reminder of something that had already been lost long before tonight. And as they began to move together under the warm glow of the lights, I noticed the way Ashley's eyes flickered briefly toward me, just for a second, a quick glance filled with something unreadable, something almost calculating, before she smiled again for the audience around her. And I realized then that this moment, this entire evening, had been orchestrated with intention. Not just the seating arrangement, not just the small humiliation tucked neatly into a polished event, but the slow, careful way she had positioned herself at the center of everything that once belonged to me. And I turned away from the dance floor before the song had ended, not because I could not bear to watch, but because I no longer needed to. And I made my way toward a quieter corner near the large windows that overlooked the garden outside, where the night air pressed softly against the glass and the distant string lights shimmered like something just out of reach. And I rested my fingertips lightly against the cool surface, grounding myself in the present, in the reality of who I was beyond this room, beyond this carefully curated celebration that had found a way to make me feel like an outsider in my own family. And I took a slow breath, letting it out just as steadily, because there was a time when I would have questioned myself, when I would have wondered if I was overreacting, if perhaps it really was just a joke, if maybe I should have laughed along and pretended not to notice. But that time had passed, quietly and without ceremony, and in its place was something far more solid, something that did not need validation from anyone else in this room. And as I stood there, watching my reflection faintly mirrored in the glass, I understood that this was not simply about a seat or a careless comment. It was about being moved, piece by piece, out of a life I had helped build. And I was no longer willing to pretend that I did not see it happening, even if I chose, for now, to remain silent. The reception carried on behind me as if nothing had shifted, as if every detail of the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. And perhaps it was, just not in the way I had once imagined. And I turned back from the window when I heard my name spoken in a tone that did not quite belong to the celebration, quieter, more deliberate. And I saw a man standing a few steps away, tall, silver-haired, his posture still straight despite the years, and it took me a second to recognize him, but then it came back to me. Thomas Harrison, an old friend of my husband, someone I had not seen since the funeral. And he gave me a small nod, not the kind people use when they are being polite, but the kind that acknowledges something unspoken, something understood without needing to be explained. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and steady, "I was wondering if I might find you here." And I offered him a faint smile, the kind that felt appropriate for the setting. "It has been a long time," I replied. And he glanced briefly toward the tables, toward the direction of the seating arrangement, and then back at me, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition. "Yes," he said, "long enough for things to change." And there was a pause, not uncomfortable, but intentional, as if he were deciding how much to say and how much to leave unsaid. And I found myself studying his expression, the way his gaze held mine without wavering, and I realized he had noticed, not just the surface details, but the meaning beneath them, the quiet message that had been delivered without ever needing to be spoken out loud. "Your husband always had a way of noticing details," he continued, almost casually, though nothing about his tone felt accidental. He used to say that the smallest gestures often revealed the most, and I felt a slight tightening in my chest at the mention of him, of the man who had once stood beside me in rooms like this, who would have never allowed something like tonight to pass unnoticed. And I nodded slowly. "He believed in that," I said, keeping my voice even. And Thomas let out a soft breath, as if confirming something to himself. He also believed in making sure the right things were in place before he left, he added, his words measured, each one landing with quiet precision. And I tilted my head slightly, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted to hear him say it, to bring whatever he was implying fully into the open. And he took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that it would not carry beyond us. I am not sure if Daniel ever told you, he said, but your husband made some very specific arrangements before he passed. And for a moment, the sounds of the reception seemed to fade into the background, the music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses all becoming distant, as if I were standing slightly outside of it all, and I held his gaze, waiting. He wanted to ensure that you would always be taken care of, Thomas continued, not just financially, but in terms of respect. And that word lingered in the air between us, heavier than the others, more deliberate. And I felt something shift inside me, not a surge of emotion, not anger or sadness, but clarity, a quiet alignment of pieces that had not quite fit together before. And I thought of the house, the accounts, the documents I had signed over the years without question, trusting that everything had been handled the way it should have been, trusting that my place in this family was secure because it had been built on decades of shared life. And yet, standing there now, I could see how easily that foundation had been eroded. Not all at once, but slowly, carefully, until I found myself seated beside a trash can at my own son's wedding. And Thomas watched me closely, as if gauging my reaction, but I gave him none beyond a small, composed nod. He always planned ahead, I said, and there was a faint trace of something in my voice, not quite emotion, but not entirely neutral either. And Thomas's expression softened just slightly. Yes, he said. He did. And then, after a brief pause, he added, you might want to take a closer look at those arrangements when you have the chance. And I let those words settle, turning them over quietly in my mind, because I understood now that this was not just a passing comment, not just a polite suggestion from an old friend, but a door being opened, gently, without force, without urgency. And I glanced once more across the room, toward the center of the celebration, where Daniel and Ashley stood, surrounded by guests, smiling, receiving congratulations, completely at ease in a world they believed they controlled. And I felt that same stillness return, that calm, steady awareness that had replaced the initial shock. And I looked back at Thomas, offering him a small, appreciative nod. Thank you, I said simply, and he inclined his head in return, as if acknowledging that something important had just been understood, without needing to be spoken any further. And as he stepped away, disappearing back into the crowd, I remained where I was for a moment longer, my reflection faint in the glass beside me. And I realized that whatever this evening had been meant to do, whatever message it had been designed to send, it had not weakened me. It had clarified something far more important, something that had been there all along, waiting for me to finally see it clearly. The rest of the evening unfolded with the same careful elegance, the same polished smiles and practiced laughter, but something inside me had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And I found myself moving through the reception not as a participant, but as an observer, noticing details I might have once overlooked. The way Ashley guided conversations with subtle precision, steering attention where she wanted it. The way Daniel followed her lead without hesitation, nodding at the right moments, laughing when expected, as if their roles had been rehearsed long before this day. And I remembered other moments, smaller ones, scattered across the past few years, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now arranged themselves into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Like the Christmas dinner I had spent preparing for hours, only to receive a last-minute message that plans had changed, that it would be just the two of them this year, followed later by photos online of a full gathering I had not been invited to, or the time I had shown up early for my grandson's birthday party, only to be told gently that I must have gotten the time wrong, even though I had written it down carefully on my calendar. And I had apologized then, quietly, assuming the mistake was mine because it was easier to doubt myself than to question them. And as these memories surfaced one by one, I felt no surge of anger, no overwhelming wave of hurt, just a quiet recognition that what had happened tonight was not an isolated incident. It was simply the most visible expression of something that had been unfolding for a long time. And I paused near one of the tables where a group of guests were discussing the ceremony, their voices light and admiring. And one of them, a woman I vaguely recognized, glanced at me and offered a polite smile. "It is such a beautiful wedding," she said, and I returned the smile with equal courtesy. "Yes, it is," I replied, because in many ways it was. The flowers were arranged perfectly, the lighting softened every corner of the room. The music carried just a right balance of warmth and celebration. Everything had been designed to create the appearance of something flawless. And perhaps that was the point, because when everything looks perfect, no one thinks to question what lies beneath. And I excused myself a moment later, not out of discomfort, but because I no longer felt the need to remain in conversations that required me to pretend. And I made my way back toward the table where I had been seated, where the small trash can still stood exactly where it had been placed, unchanged, unapologetic. And I looked at it for a moment, not with humiliation, but with a kind of detached clarity, as if it were no longer an insult, but evidence, a physical representation of something that could not be denied or explained away. And I reached down and adjusted the edge of the tablecloth beside it, smoothing it out carefully. An ordinary gesture, one I had performed countless times in my life, but this time it felt different, deliberate, as if I were marking the moment in some quiet internal way. And I sat down again, folding my hands in my lap, my posture straight, my expression calm, and I allowed myself to consider what Thomas had said, about arrangements, about intentions that had been set in place long before tonight. And I realized that while Ashley might have orchestrated this evening with precision, she had done so under the assumption that she understood the full picture, that she knew exactly where everyone stood and what they were entitled to. And that assumption, more than anything else, felt like the beginning of something, not an end. And I glanced across the room once more, catching sight of Daniel as he laughed at something one of his friends had said, completely at ease, completely unaware. And I felt no urge to interrupt that moment, no desire to confront or correct, because whatever needed to be addressed would not be handled here, not in the middle of a celebration designed to distract from what truly mattered. And as I sat there, surrounded by the soft glow of candlelight and the distant hum of conversation, I understood that silence, when chosen deliberately, was not weakness. It was patience. And patience, I had learned, could be far more powerful than anything said in the heat of the moment. The evening continued to move forward with the same seamless rhythm, speeches blending into laughter, laughter dissolving into music, and I remained where I was for a while longer, allowing the moment to settle into something I could fully understand, not just as an experience, but as a turning point. And when I finally stood again, it was not out of discomfort or a need to escape, but with a quiet sense of purpose that felt new and strangely steady. And I made my way toward the far side of the room, where the gift table had been arranged with careful attention, silver-wrapped boxes stacked neatly beside handwritten cards, each one representing a gesture of goodwill, of support, of belief in the future being celebrated tonight. And I paused there, letting my fingers rest lightly on the edge of the table as I looked down at the collection. And I could not help but think of the many years I had spent giving without question, birthdays, holidays, milestones, always showing up with something thoughtful, something meaningful, because that was what family did, or at least what I had always believed family was meant to do. And I let out a slow breath, my reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of a nearby serving tray. And I studied it for a moment, the fine lines at the corners of my eyes, the silver woven through my hair, not with regret, but with recognition, because every year etched there had been spent building something I had once thought was unshakable. And yet here I was, standing at the edge of it, no longer at the center, no longer even acknowledged as part of its foundation. And I straightened slightly, my shoulders aligning with a quiet resolve that did not need to be announced. And as I turned, I caught sight of Ashley again, this time across the room, speaking with a group of guests, her laughter light and effortless, her hand resting briefly on Daniel's arm, as if to anchor herself exactly where she intended to remain. And I watched them for a moment, not with bitterness, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of clarity that made everything sharper, more defined. And I realized that whatever role they had assigned to me in this new version of their life, it had been based on the assumption that I would accept it without question, that I would continue to give, to support, to remain quietly in the background while they moved forward, as if I were simply part of the past. And that assumption, more than anything else, felt like something I could no longer carry. And I turned away from them then, my gaze shifting instead toward the exit doors at the far end of the hall, where the evening air waited just beyond the glass, cool and still. And I began to walk in that direction, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, each step deliberate, as if I were following a path that had only just revealed itself to me. And as I reached the doors, I paused briefly, resting my hand against the handle, feeling the cool metal beneath my palm. And I allowed myself one last glance back at the room, at the celebration that continued without interruption, without acknowledgement of what had taken place just beneath its surface. And I felt no urge to return to my seat, no desire to reclaim a space that had been so carefully redefined, because I understood now that my place was not something that could be assigned by a seating chart or erased by a careless gesture. And with that thought settling firmly in my mind, I stepped outside into the night, the sound of the reception softening behind me as the door closed. And the quiet that greeted me was not empty, but full, filled with a sense of something beginning rather than ending. And I drew in a slow breath of the cool air, letting it steady me, letting it clear away whatever remained of the confusion I might have once felt. Because what lay ahead was no longer uncertain, not in the way it had been before. And as I stood there beneath the faint glow of the outdoor lights, I knew that whatever arrangements had been set in place, whatever truths had yet to be uncovered, I would not approach them as someone seeking permission or validation, but as someone who finally understood the value of her own place, whether others chose to recognize it or not. The night air lingered around me, cool against my skin, carrying just enough quiet to let my thoughts settle into something sharper, something more defined. And I did not rush to leave, did not reach for my phone or call for a ride. Instead, I stood there, beneath the soft glow of the outdoor lights, letting the silence do its work. Because for the first time in a long while, I was not trying to explain anything away, not trying to make sense of someone else's behavior in a way that would excuse it. I was simply allowing the truth to exist as it was, clear and unfiltered. And after a few minutes, I reached into my handbag and took out my phone, my fingers steady as I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I had not called in years, the name that once represented stability, clarity, and the kind of careful planning my husband had always valued. And I hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button, holding the phone to my ear as it rang once, then twice, and then a familiar voice answered, older, perhaps, but still carrying the same measured tone I remembered. "This is Robert Greene," he said, and I closed my eyes briefly, grounding myself in the sound of it. "Robert, this is Margaret Collins," I replied, my voice calm, even, without any trace of the evening that had just unfolded behind me. And there was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a note of recognition. "Margaret, it has been a long time," he said, and I could almost picture him sitting behind his desk, papers neatly arranged, everything in its proper place. "Yes," I answered, "it has," and I let that settle for a moment before continuing. "I was hoping we could meet, perhaps tomorrow, if your schedule allows." And there was another pause, not hesitant but thoughtful, as if he were already anticipating what this call might mean. "Of course," he said, "I can make time. What is this regarding?" And I glanced back briefly at the building behind me, the faint music still audible through the walls, a distant echo of a celebration I no longer needed to be part of. And I turned away again, focusing instead on what lay ahead. "I would like to review the arrangements my husband made before he passed," I said, choosing my words carefully,
not because I was unsure, but because I understood the importance of precision. And Robert's tone shifted slightly, becoming more attentive, more deliberate. "I see," he replied. "Yes, I believe that would be wise." And there was something in the way he said it that confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that there were details, decisions, protections perhaps, that I had not fully examined, not because they were hidden, but because I had trusted that everything was as it should be, and I had never felt the need to question it, until now.
"Tomorrow morning would be best," he continued. 10 o'clock, if that works for you. And I nodded, even though he could not see me. "That works perfectly," I said. And after a few more brief words, the call ended, leaving me once again in the quiet of the night. But this time, the silence felt different. Not empty, not uncertain, but purposeful. And I slipped my phone back into my bag, my hand lingering there for a moment as I considered the path I had just set in motion. Because whatever I was about to uncover, whatever had been arranged in ways I had not yet fully understood, it would not be something I approached with hesitation or doubt. And I took a slow breath, lifting my gaze toward the dark sky above, the faint outline of clouds drifting across it. And I felt a steadiness settle into place, something firm and unshakable. Because this was no longer about a single evening or a careless act disguised as humor. It was about understanding exactly where I stood, not in their version of the story, but in the one that had been written long before tonight. And as I turned and began to walk toward the parking lot, my steps measured and calm, I knew that by this time tomorrow, things would begin to look very different. Not because I intended to change them in anger or haste, but because I was finally ready to see them clearly for what they were. And that, I had come to realize, was where real change always began. I woke up the next morning before the alarm, the room still dim with the early light just beginning to filter through the curtains. And for a moment I lay there, perfectly still, listening to the quiet of the house around me. The kind of quiet that used to feel lonely, but now felt clear, as if everything unnecessary had finally been stripped away. And I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor, grounding myself in the simple, familiar routine of starting a new day. Because there was something about this morning that felt different. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like the calm before something important comes into focus. And I moved through my usual motions without rushing, making coffee, setting a single cup on the kitchen counter, watching the steam rise in thin, quiet spirals. And I thought about the years I had spent in this house, the countless mornings that had begun in exactly this way, preparing breakfast for Daniel before school, packing lunches, making sure everything was in place so he could step out into the world without worry. And I took a small sip of the coffee, letting the warmth settle, because those memories were still mine, untouched by anything that had happened since, and nothing anyone did could take that away. And when I finished, I set the cup in the sink and went to my room to get ready, choosing a simple outfit, nothing extravagant, just something appropriate for a meeting that I knew would matter more than anything that had taken place the night before. And as I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not search for signs of age or fatigue. I simply met my own gaze, steady and direct. And I saw something there that had not been as clear before, something grounded, something certain. And I gave a small nod, not to reassure myself, but to acknowledge that I was exactly where I needed to be. And by the time I stepped outside, the sun had risen fully, casting a soft, even light across the street, and I walked to my car with the same measured pace I had carried with me since the night before. Not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. And the drive across town felt shorter than usual, the familiar streets passing by without distraction, because my thoughts were not scattered the way they might have been in the past. They were focused, aligned with a single purpose. And when I arrived at the office building, I parked and sat for a moment with the engine off, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, taking in the quiet of the space before stepping into whatever came next. And then I opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind me with a soft, final click. And I made my way inside, the cool air of the lobby greeting me as I crossed the polished floor toward the reception desk, where a young woman looked up and offered a polite smile. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" And I returned the smile with equal calm. "I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Robert Greene," I replied.
my voice steady. And she nodded, checking her screen before gesturing toward the seating area. "He will be with you shortly." And I thanked her, taking a seat in one of the chairs, my posture straight, my hands resting lightly in my lap. And I did not reach for my phone, did not distract myself with anything unnecessary. I simply waited, present in the moment. And after a few minutes, I heard my name again, this time spoken from a doorway down the hall, and I looked up to see Robert standing there, just as I remembered him, composed, attentive, his expression professional but not distant. And I rose, walking toward him with the same quiet confidence I had carried with me since leaving the reception. And as I stepped into his office, I knew, without any hesitation, that whatever I was about to learn, I would meet it not as someone uncertain of her place, but as someone who had finally decided to understand it fully.
Robert closed the door behind me with a soft click and gestured toward the chair across from his desk, and I sat down without hesitation, placing my handbag neatly beside me, my hands resting calmly in my lap as I took in the room. The same dark wood shelves lined with organized binders, the same framed certificates on the wall, everything in its place, just as I remembered. And Robert took his seat, folding his hands together as he studied me for a brief moment, not intrusively, but with a kind of quiet assessment, as if he were measuring the distance between who I had been the last time he saw me and who I was now. "You mentioned you wanted to review the arrangements your husband made," he said, his tone direct but not rushed, and I nodded once. "Yes, I believe it is time," I replied, and there was no tremor in my voice, no uncertainty, only clarity. And he inclined his head slightly before reaching for a folder on the corner of his desk, one that looked untouched, carefully preserved, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. And as he opened it, the sound of paper shifting filled the space between us, steady and deliberate. And I watched as he scanned the first page, confirming something silently before sliding the document toward me. "Your husband was very thorough," he began. "He anticipated a number of possibilities and structured his estate accordingly." And I leaned forward slightly, my eyes moving over the lines of text, legal language that once might have felt distant or overwhelming, but now seemed precise, almost reassuring in its structure. And as I read, certain phrases stood out, conditions, protections, clauses that were clearly not written without intention, and I felt a quiet understanding begin to take shape, piece by piece. "There are provisions here," Robert continued, "that ensure you retain primary control over the family assets, including the house, the investment accounts, and several other holdings." And I lifted my gaze from the page, meeting his eyes. "Primary control," I repeated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. And he nodded. "Yes, Margaret, your husband made it very clear that these assets were to remain under your authority for as long as you choose." And there was a pause, just long enough for the weight of that statement to settle, and I felt something inside me align with a kind of quiet certainty, because this was not a suggestion or a courtesy. It was a decision that had been made deliberately, long before any of the events of the previous evening. And I looked back down at the document, continuing to read, and then I saw it, a clause written with unmistakable clarity, one that outlined specific conditions under which any future inheritance could be altered or revoked, particularly in cases of what was described as demonstrated disregard or mistreatment. And I let my eyes linger on those words for a moment longer than the others, not out of surprise, but out of recognition, because suddenly, the conversation from the night before, Thomas's careful choice of words, the subtle emphasis on respect, it all came together in a way that left no room for doubt. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands still calm, my posture unchanged. But inside, something had shifted, from understanding to awareness. And Robert watched me closely, as if he could see the moment that realization settled into place. "Your husband trusted you to make the right decisions," he said, his voice measured, "especially if circumstances changed." And I gave a small nod, my gaze steady. "He always did," I replied. And I looked once more at the document in front of me, not as something abstract or distant, but as something very real, very present, something that had been placed in my hands not out of obligation, but out of trust. And I understood then that whatever had been assumed about my position, whatever narrative had been quietly constructed around me in my absence, it had been built on incomplete information. And I allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch my lips, not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity, because for the first time since the previous evening, I could see the full picture, not just the surface, not just the appearance of control, but the structure beneath it. And as I closed the folder gently, my fingers resting on its edge for a brief moment,
I knew that what came next would not require confrontation or raised voices. It would require something far more precise, something far more deliberate. And I was ready for that.
When I stepped out of Robert's office, the hallway felt brighter than when I had entered, not because the lighting had changed, but because something inside me had. And I walked toward the exit with the same steady pace, the folder no longer in my hands, but its contents firmly settled in my mind. Each clause, each condition, each carefully chosen word forming a structure that could not be ignored or undone by assumptions or convenient narratives. And as I reached my car and sat behind the wheel, I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I allowed myself a moment to simply sit there, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, feeling the quiet certainty that had replaced any lingering doubt. Because what I had learned was not just information, it was confirmation. Confirmation that my place had never been as fragile as it had been made to seem, that the foundation beneath me had not disappeared. It had simply been overlooked, or perhaps deliberately ignored. And I let out a slow breath before finally starting the car, the engine coming to life with a soft hum as I pulled out of the parking lot and into the flow of the day. And the drive home felt different from the one the day before, not because the streets had changed, but because I no longer carried the same weight with me. And when I arrived at the house, I parked in the driveway and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the space greeting me in a way that felt grounding rather than lonely. And I moved through the room slowly, not searching for anything, but noticing everything. The photographs on the walls, the furniture arranged just as it had always been, the quiet presence of a life that had been built with intention. And I paused in the living room, my gaze resting on a framed picture of my husband, his expression calm, steady, the same quiet strength I had relied on for so many years. And I found myself giving a small nod, as if acknowledging a conversation that did not need words. Because in many ways, he had already anticipated this moment, already put the pieces in place for me to see what needed to be seen when the time came. And I turned away from the photograph and made my way to the kitchen, setting my bag down on the counter before reaching for a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I considered what would come next, not with urgency, not with any sense of needing to act immediately, but with the understanding that timing, like everything else, mattered. And I knew that Daniel and Ashley would return from their celebration soon, carrying with them whatever version of the evening they believed had unfolded, confident in the roles they had assigned, confident in the assumptions they had made. And I allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to form as I set the glass down, because for the first time, I understood that I did not need to correct them, did not need to argue or explain. All I needed to do was allow them to continue exactly as they were, at least for now, because the truth did not require force to reveal itself. It required patience. And I walked over to the dining table, running my hand lightly along its surface, remembering the countless meals shared there, the conversations, the laughter, the life that had filled this space long before it became something they thought they could control. And I pulled out a chair and sat down, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly in front of me. And I looked toward the front door, not waiting anxiously, not anticipating confrontation, but simply aware that when the next moment came, I would meet it differently than I ever had before. Not as someone seeking to hold on to what was being taken, but as someone who already knew exactly what could never be taken at all. And in that quiet, steady realization, I found something far more powerful than any reaction I could have given the night before. Because now, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was simply a matter of time.